Hey guys, welcome back to Into the Storm, Freedom to Live Counseling. My name is Rob McIntyre. I'm a addiction counselor, and it's been a while since I've done a YouTube or podcast with you guys. And today I wanted to do something that really is a subject I really enjoy talking about, and it's relapse prevention, but it's more about a structure in how to stay sober and in the recovery process. So I'm going to show you actually a document that I'm more than willing to give you guys. It's just a little checklist. On here you can see, as I'm showing you this, there's the ABCs of recovery. I'm going to go through that with you. There's the proactive and intentional we're going to talk about today. Bottom line, boundaries, consequences, secondary boundaries, consequences, the 6 commitments, the acronym HALTS, and then SLIP, and then an exercise down at the bottom that's just really helpful to do. So we're going to cover that today in the time permitted, and then probably do a second one covering some of the additional aspects of it. So first off, let me just say, I think this is one of the most critical things to put together before you leave either treatment or you leave your therapist for the first time of trying to get into recovering. For you loved ones, this is something you can join in with somebody in recovery on, is trying to help them in their process, something to hold them accountable in. So the ABCs of recovery was just something I came up with, just really simple way of remembering what to really focus on when you're into recovery. So the A stands for accountability, the B stands for boundaries, the C stands for consequences, and then the S stands for sobriety. So as I showed you on that piece of paper on the top part of it, you can actually use the paper as like a checklist every day. When you get up in the morning, there's going to be some things I'm going to talk to you about doing every day, and you can actually just begin the process of looking at the ABCs of recovery so you can remind yourself what I need to stay focused on. So the ABCs are accountability, boundaries, consequences, and sobriety. And I'm going to go into a little more detail on these in a sec. But one of the things I love to talk to people about is just really trying to understand addiction. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I was in law enforcement for almost 16 years, ran a police academy afterwards, and did some other things. But one of the things you understand about being in law enforcement, and probably military folks who've served overseas, is you got to know your enemy. And what I like to say is you need to know this addiction. You got to know that this addiction, if it was a human, it would be diabolical. And the purpose of it is to destroy your life, ultimately kill you, but take you down, take your family down, take everything that you love down before it destroys you. The outcomes of addiction we know through studies is death, incarceration, or mental institutions. So, it's not the type of friend that you really want to have. And so a lot of times what I'll talk to people about when they're in recovery is I'm going, this is not an intellectual issue. Nobody puts their hand in the fire twice. One time should be enough. But this addiction is diabolical. It's a toxic friendship. It's programming every addict. Every person who gets into an addiction is somebody who has been programmed, and then there's algorithms, if you will, that play out through your life. And so when I say algorithms, I probably don't mean it literally like the algorithm in a formula, but it's more like Amazon or Google. When you search for something, those search engines will end up finding something that it may think you like. And so, for instance, your addiction will do the same thing. You may like this. And so when you are coming out of an addiction, what you are having to do is you're really having to reprogram your mind, your emotions, your psyche. There's so much of your addiction that is subconscious that you cannot just think because you had a wonderful weekend or a great session with a therapist, or even, as I say, with some of the folks I work with who are inpatient at a rehab, just because you spend 30 days at a rehab, you can't expect that this addiction won't mess with you when you get out. The way I like to say it is, when you left your addiction, it was thriving. Now that you're in this place, it's kind of a bubble, but when you leave it, you're going to go right back to the same place where it thrived. And so we just can't leave the structures of recovery to nothing. You know, if you don't have a plan, then you don't have a plan. What I usually will tell folks is, if the addiction is as diabolical as I just said, it's much like a terrorist. You don't negotiate with it. And if we negotiate with terrorism, you know, it's ridiculous, because their intent is to kill. Well, your addiction's intent is to kill. Family members, your loved one's addiction's intention is to kill. And so if you don't think of it in the same way like I did with law enforcement, on the inside of my locker when I worked patrol, I ended up having photographs. I had photographs of my family, my children, and then I had 2 photographs of some deputies I knew who got killed in the line of duty. And they weren't the happy little photos you get when you start a job. No, they were the crime scene photos, and both of them had they were both killed through headshots. And so what it did for me, and I know this is morbid, but what it did is, every time I went to work, I was prepared in my mind and in my heart and in my equipment, that I was willing to consider that I may face something that could kill me, but I'm going to be ready. And so every day an addict, when they wake up, they need to prepare as if their addiction is coming after them. What I again like to say to folks is that addictions don't take vacations, they don't take sick leave, and they don't take FMLA. Actually, they didn't social distance, and they didn't go on furlough. The addiction comes hard after you 24/7. And it tries to attack you even when you're asleep. So to the degree that it is proactive and intentional, in my opinion, you have to be proactive and intentional against it. So if you think that you can actually just float down the stream with recovery and not have to fight this thing, you are wrong. You are wrong. You have to go upstream like salmon do. This is about learning how to fight something that has been part of your life probably way before you were introduced to the substance or the behavior. Again, that's where the programming comes into play. So even if you do get sober, you're still going to have addictive behaviors. You're still going to have parts of your life that are out of control, because the addiction programs us. The addiction programs our lives, and the addiction makes us selfish. The addiction really does everything to make us immature in certain areas, or in all areas, instant gratifiers. So we're not talking about something that is just, you know, we can turn off and on. No, it impacts us to the deepest levels of who we are. And that's why recovery and sobriety is so critical. I came up with something years ago called the 3 phases of recovery. And what I'm going to share with you today is just the attitudes of recovery. And I will share with you guys sometime down the road about that. But what I want to say, that there's 3 attitudes that I've noticed over the time of recovery. And the first phase of recovery, I would say the first year and a half or so, would be, the attitude needs to be for the addict in recovery is I have to, meaning I cannot neglect my responsibility to the fact that this addiction is going to want to romance me back into being relapsing or whatever. And by the way, when you relapse, when you cross the bottom line boundary of your addiction, what ends up happening for most people is they go right back to where they left off. They don't go all the way to start. No, you go right back to where you left off in your addiction. So if you had a pretty significant alcohol addiction, you're not going to be able to go all the way back to like 1 beer or 1 drink. No, your brain, once it tastes it, once it remembers, it will come back like a vengeance, and you will want to get it back to that level. Behaviorally, same thing. You are already advanced in your use or your behavior. And so when I say proactive and intentional, you want to have things that help you, that are obstacles before when you get into a place where you need to literally work your recovery and your sobriety. So I want to start with accountability. So what is accountability? Well, accountability, it's interesting. In the regular word is just being responsible. But in recovery, you need to understand that accountability is not me, it's the we. It takes more than one person to become accountable. And with addiction, we need to borrow strength. We need to, as I said in one of my earlier podcasts, encouragement is lending courage. And so when you get into recovery, you need other people who have actually done this, people who understand what it's like to be in recovery. So when it's accountability, you need a support team, you need a fire team, you need backup, you need a partner, you need a sponsor. So do not do this alone. I don't suggest family members typically, because family members tend to have a lot involved emotionally. Now they can be supportive, but I would say find somebody in a recovery group or whatever, a church or something, but they are recovering addicts, so they know how to challenge you when you are starting to slide, or your programming for your addiction is starting to call out to you. Remember me, remember the long enjoyable walks on the beach, remember those cool nights when we were together. That's what your addiction does. It's like the sirens in Homer's Odyssey. It's gonna cry out to you, and you're gonna take your life and get close to those shores and wreck your ship. So you do not want to do this alone. You want to have sober people doing this with you. So accountability is crucial. I would also suggest that in this accountability that you have some kind of random test that helps keep you and your addiction on its toes, such as if you are struggling with alcohol, you could do a breathalyzer or a urine test. Same thing with opiates or cocaine. With my sex addicts folks, I do polygraphs, and polygraphs work really well because lying tends to be something that is pretty common, obviously, in addiction. You are ashamed and you feel guilty about your drug use or your alcohol use or the behavior, and so having a random test, and I would suggest a test either like a polygraph. For instance, I have one client right now that I'm actually working with, and he does random UAs, urine analysis, and then once a year we're going to do a polygraph. And the way the polygraph works in this is it just verifies that he was being honest on his UAs. We're verifying that what he has said historically is true, and it's just for him in his mind to remember, hey, I got this polygraph coming up, I can't beat that thing. And it's a great tool. A lot of the studies show that you can rebuild trust in a relationship by the use of polygraph about 10 times to 50 times faster than if you weren't to have one. So that's accountability. Accountability is critical. Boundaries. What are boundaries? Well, boundaries are like fences that keep the bad things out and keep the good things inside. And it's interesting when I share with folks about this part of recovery, what I usually do is draw a cyclone fence. And what I do is I say, how many times, if this fence was your drug of choice, how many times did you hop this fence in your lifetime? And many of them go thousands and thousands of times. And I said, was it significant the first couple times that you crossed that fence? And they would say, yes, of course. But they said as time went on, it got easier and easier, and they didn't think much about it. And so I usually say, well, when you're in martial arts, they say do something 1,000 times, you won't need to think about it. Well, that's where addiction's been. Every time you crossed a bottom line boundary or acted out, whatever the terminology to use your drug of choice or the behavior, what happens is that just reinforces. It's ring the bell, feed the dog, ring the bell, feed the dog. The dog salivates when it hears the bell. So the addict, when they hop the fence, they reinforce it with their drug of choice or the behavior, and it reinforces and creates these neurological pathways that make it extremely difficult for you to not be sensitive to the stimuli in about where you used your drug of choice, the things you did, the music you listened to, the smells, the scents you smelled. All those things are taken into the human brain, and they are locked down, and they're put into this experience of addiction. So hopping this fence over and over again becomes a very, very powerful experience for us, mostly when you are using a very intense substance or behavior. So with boundaries, what I like to say is, okay, if you've crossed this fence over and over, then what are you going to do to now make this fence look lethal to you? What are you going to do to make this fence look ugly? How are you going to now change this so when you look at this fence, this very thing that seduced you and you went over and over again, how are you going to make it look not so inviting? And I like to say, well, then on the cyclone fence, we need to put some barbed wire on the top, Constantine wire, the real sharp razor wire that you see a lot of times on prison fences or something. You also want to put some big signs. I got a crazy story about some big signs. One time I traveled to Asia, and I ended up coming off of a plane in Taiwan. We're going to connect to another flight, and there are these huge signs in white background, red lettering saying warning and attention, and in black lettering it said, if you are found guilty transporting narcotics in the state or the country of Taiwan, the penalty is death. And I just remember that. I mean, it's over 20 years ago that I saw that, and I thought, man, that is memorable. Well, you need to do something like that on that fence, on that very thing that you so love for so many years over and over again. You need to put a big sign up there, and it says, attention, caution. If I choose to use this drug again or do this behavior again, I will lose this, and I will lose this, and I will lose this. This could cost me my life. I've talked to enough alcoholics that they drink again, their doctors have told them they're high probability of dying, losing use of their liver and so on, and opiate addicts. It's just crazy. Sex addicts will lose their marriage. They'll get some disease. In some cases, lose their jobs. So what you want to do is when you begin to create your structure, you want to put this just straight out there and say, this is what I'm going to lose. Many times I'll suggest put your family up there, put a picture of your family. I will lose them. So when now if I choose to hop this fence, I also choose to say goodbye to them. What I like to say is, the victim mindset is I have no choice. So addiction loves to keep us in the victim mindset that I can't fix this, that it's too hard. I'm, Eeyore, it's too difficult. And so what for addicts, they don't have the strength, or they don't have the wherewithal to think of it like, hey, I have a choice. But when you start working on your recovery and you start to get sober, you start to go, man, I do have a choice. I do have a choice to stay sober. And this is what I'm choosing. I choose today to save my family by focusing on accountability, boundaries, consequences, and sobriety. I choose to focus and choose to love my wife, to be honest. So those are great things to put on the fence. The other thing I usually say on that fence is, let's plug it in. Some of you, maybe when you're kids, hopefully not as adults, but have experienced an electric fence. I've heard some crazy stories. We're not going into it on this, but people have done some crazy things. I remember as a kid jumping in the air and grabbing onto it and not staying in the air long enough and getting a good jolt. But you want to really electrify that fence, because again, in recovery, we know that the human brain loves pleasure and it hates pain, and pain is the thing that changes us. And so if you apply pain to the very thing that used to bring pleasure, it can change the way you think. It can change the way you behave. Such as for obsessive compulsive disorder, years ago, they found that use of rubber bands on somebody's wrist. I have a little band here from a law enforcement officer who was killed in the line of duty, but it's a rubber band, and actually, if you snap it, it'll hurt. Well, if the studies show that if you snap that every time you have an intrusive thought of your addiction, within 30 days, every time you snap, you get an intrusive thought to remind you, a triggering thought to remind you about your addiction, and you snap it, you potentially can reduce 80% of those thoughts in 30 days. You know, they found this to be very useful with obsessive compulsive disorder. And so what that kind of plays out is that the brain associates a thought with pleasure, and it continues to reinforce. You associate a thought with pain, it starts to reduce the thinking. So powerful behavioral way to change the way you think and to change the way your brain works. So that is just another way to be, proactive and intentional against your addiction. It's another way to electrify that fence. And then one of the other things I would really suggest is when you come up with your consequences for your bottom line boundaries, and again, the bottom line boundary usually is your drug of choice or the behavior. So that bottom line boundary, that fence, is literally your drug of choice, your behavior, your substance. And so you are no longer going to use that. You are no longer going to give yourself permission to have access to that. You are no longer going to allow yourself to think that you can consume or behave in that manner again. And what will happen is within 30 days, which is usually the toughest time, you will begin to change your behavior. It takes 21 days to learn a habit. It takes 63 days to undo one. Addictions are very complex. They are a powerful part of the human brain. When we become compulsive or addicted to a behavior that produces either a massive release of chemicals in our brains, or we introduce chemicals externally, it is massive to the brain, and the brain loves it. The brain will pursue it. But you introduce pain, you introduce a consequence, you distance yourself from that within 30 days. That usually is the hardest part of recovery, is those first 30 days. So the first 30 days, I've heard it said it's hell. Second 30 days, I've heard it to be said, for you Catholic folks out there, it's purgatory. It's kind of in between. And then the final 30, 40 days is kind of heaven. You start to realize after about 60 days, it actually gets to be significantly easier, and the brain stops pinging, stops going, hey, remember me, remember me. Now, you just got to understand, you may be in a situation where you're going to be reminded of your addiction because of different people, different circumstances, visual cues, audio cues, olfactory cues. So just make sure you consider, what were some of the things that usually led me to my use. And we can talk about that more. If you have questions, feel free to contact me on that. But again, that fence needs to be something that you don't want to ever cross again. And finally, on this fence, I want you to understand bottom line boundaries is you may actually need to put your money where your mouth is. So a couple of things that I've had people do, and I know this is common in the process addiction world, is if a loved one says, you do this again, we will lose the marriage, I would say, well, let's be proactive. Let's be intentional. Why don't you, let's say a loved one says, I want to be legally separated. Well, then you go get the paperwork and you begin to fill it out, and you have it nearby wherever you have, an office or something. And that would be something that you'd fill out if you choose to cross this. What it does is it just really puts into play the importance of your sobriety and the consequences. The consequences many times can be the very thing that will make you go, no, I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose that relationship. I don't want to pay the price that I've paid for this drug of choice. And finally, just a couple other suggestions. I've had folks who've had DUIs or been booked into jail, or whatever, maybe some photographs. There was this one gentleman who showed me a photograph of when he was really, really intoxicated. It was brutal to look at. It wasn't the same guy I was talking to. It just, he really looked intoxicated, and that was a great reminder for him of how wonderful his addiction was. And that's kind of the thing you have to remember. It's not always that wonderful. Yeah, maybe momentarily, maybe it takes you to heaven momentarily, but it takes you quickly to hell. So let's not be naive about this anymore. It wants to kill you, and you need to be sober and vigilant and alert against its cues and its ways that has seduced you. So bottom line, boundaries, consequences. Remember, the consequences are the teeth to the boundaries. If you don't have consequences, the boundaries don't mean a thing. It's like the parent who says, you're going to get in trouble for that. You're going to get in trouble for that. Knock that off. But then there's no consequences. There's no appropriate corporal punishment. There's no follow-up. What good parent does that? So, when you get into recovery, make sure that there's something that's painful to you that will remind you, hey, this is not going to just happen because we're in a moment of que sera, everything's going to be fine, just take a walk in the park. No, you choose to do your addiction again. You choose to pay the price. You choose to lose the family. You choose to create major health issues in your life. All right, so before I run out of time with this session, I'm going to follow up on secondary boundaries and consequences in a sec. I'm going to go over some of the acronyms really quick here. So I want to go over SLIP. So it's spelled S-L-I-P, SLIP. And I'll show you the paper again. So SLIP right here. And that stands for sobriety loses its priority. Sobriety loses its priority. It's just a great reminder that, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, oh, I had a slip. And it's like, okay, well, were you doing your work? Were you, did you create a structure? Are you staying accountable? So on and so on. No, I stopped. I thought I was okay. Well, slip is when you stop focusing every day on staying sober. Sobriety loses its priority. And then the second one is the halts. And what I did is I came up with H2 ALTS. And so the H2 stands for hungry, hurting, so 2 H's, angry, lonely, tired, and stressed. Hungry, hurting, angry, lonely, tired, and stressed. And what's really important about this acronym is anytime you're experiencing one or more of these, you are 80% more likely to act out or to have a relapse. And what I like to tell people is we're not just talking about physically hurting when I'm saying you're hurting or you're hungry. We're talking about, how about emotionally hurting? How about spiritually hurting? How about emotionally hungry? How about spiritually hungry? You guys hopefully have listened to the 3 stomachs, and you know that we are 3-dimensional as creatures. And so the hunger can impact us emotionally and spiritually as well as physically, or the pain. So just remember, if you're any of those, you've got to figure out ways. And I usually say, let's be proactive. Let's create some ways to deal with pain. Let's create some ways to deal with your hunger. And I'm going to talk to you about that in the next half hour. Anger, part of recovery and sobriety is to learn how to deal with your emotions, emotional regulation, okay? And so you're going to have to learn how to deal with anger. Loneliness, with this COVID-19, connection is critical. Loneliness is a characteristic of your addiction. If you're already a lonely person, have an addiction, it multiplies it, it amplifies it. When you isolate, just understand your addiction's purpose is to isolate you so you feel lonely, so you will use your addiction. So you got to fight loneliness. You've got to become aware of what you need as a human to stay healthy, to keep your thoughts being healthy, to not allow yourself to get into that previous programming. Tired, part of recovery and growing up as an adult is learning how to take care of yourself, self-care. Don't push yourself the way you used to. As you get older, I'm seeing this all the time. For me, you have to take time for yourself. You need to know, what do you need to stay healthy? What do you need to not be frustrated? What do you need to keep healthy in your headspace? And then finally, stress. I like to say it this way. There's two types of stress. There's distress and eustress. Distress is the negative stress. That's the one we do not like. It's when we're overwhelmed. But eustress is actually the type of stress that we do to fight distress. Eustress many times is like running on a treadmill, going for a workout. It's exercising. It's actually one of the best ways we can fight stress in our lives non-pharmaceutically. It is a way for us to deal with stress in a healthy way. So that's the halts. We went over slip, halts, and the ABCs. First, the bottom line boundaries and consequences. In the next half hour, I'll finish the document. We'll go through the 6 commitments, and we'll talk about a couple exercises you can do. And they're really helpful to help you build the structure. Hopefully this has been good for you. Again, I will be following up for another half hour on this. This is Into the Storm, Freedom to Live. I'm Rob McIntyre. Please, if this is helpful, subscribe, like, share, and look forward to seeing you guys again. Take care.